Dear listeners, just a quick note before we start the show. The Three Things podcast will be going on a short break starting tomorrow. And this is because our team is currently recovering from some minor health issues. This means that there would not be an episode released on Thursday and Friday. Though we do hope to recover in full speed and return in time for Monday's episode, that is on the 22nd. We apologize for the interruption and thank you for tuning in. Now, on with the show. Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. On Monday, India completed 75 years of independence. On that day, we released a very special episode where we spoke to political scientist Pratap Bhanu Mehta, economist Jayati Ghosh, and filmmaker Syed Akhtar Mirza about what is worth celebrating about the country after all these years. But we thought now is a good time to also assess how India's economy has fared since 1947. Because no doubt that there has been growth, but how has that growth been compared to other nations? And what are the areas that really need attention? And what are the measures that we should be looking at to figure this out? These are the questions that we will answer in this episode. And to do that, joining us is Udit Misra, who writes on the economy for the Indian Express. So Udit, tell us what measure or indicator can we look at first to figure out how India's economy has fared since 1947?
Yeah, so typically GDP is one big indicator that everybody talks about, primarily because that is the most macro number for any economy. It's telling you the overall size of the economy.
Right, it's telling us about all the activity done by companies, individuals, and governments in a country in a given year. So let's start with GDP then. What can you tell us about how India's GDP has grown during this period?
Yeah, so when you look at GDP over the whole period, you'll find that India has made giant strides. The total GDP has grown considerably, but there are two ways to look at it. One is obviously looking back at the past and saying how far we have come, but the way to contextualize it is also to look at how other countries that we typically compare ourselves with, or we should compare ourselves with, how they have done. And if we see that, then China is one good example. India and China had very comparable GDPs till about 1970s, even 80s. And then within a couple of decades, China just leapfrogged and its GDP became twice ours. And today it's almost like 5 times India's. So that is one way to look at it. There are other metrics also, which is to look at maybe GDP per capita to understand how things have panned out.
Okay, and could you tell us what is the difference between GDP and GDP per capita, and what does it reveal about India's economy?
Yeah, so with GDP per capita, for example, we bring in the population measure. So if you just look at GDP, you'll find that India is about to overtake United Kingdom, which was our colonial master. But if you were to sort of go beyond and say GDP per capita, which is like the total GDP divided by the population of a country, then we find that United Kingdom is far ahead of us, and we also find that then we are very close to Pakistan or Bangladesh or those countries. China is far ahead of us, but less so because China also has a massive population. And countries like South Korea, who may have in aggregate lower than us in terms of GDP, but in per capita terms, they are much higher. So per capita GDP, when you look at it, it gives you a sense of what an average person, how well they are placed, although it is misleading in its own way because it is average and often it happens there are massive inequalities and the per capita also doesn't capture every aspect of the reality. And, some people look at purchasing power parity, which is to say not just compare it by absolute dollars, but look at how one basket of goods is bought by across the world. Even in those terms, the grading for India doesn't change. So in per capita terms, our income levels are very low as against some of the richer countries or comparable countries like China.
And Udit, what is the reason that China has managed to grow its GDP so much over this period and India hasn't, especially considering they started out with similar GDPs?
So one of the things that China did was that in the 80s, China opened up its economy and really took part in global exporting process. And within their overall structure where government controlled it tightly, they did create a capitalistic system within that framework and became part of a global supply chain. And that level of growth and investment in infrastructure, that just created a massive engine for growth for them. And this is quite a remarkable study of what China has been able to achieve in the last 3-4 decades and how it has grown year on year at almost 9 or 10% kind of levels and really improved the income levels across the country. Created jobs, created prosperity. So maybe they don't have as much political freedom, but in terms of economic prosperity, they have a considerable success.
And did we get left behind because we started liberalizing our economy much later, that is in the 90s?
Yes, that is one thing that we did it much later, but we also did it in a very, not as openly as we could have. As it is often said, there's a strong consensus for weak reforms in India. So it's like, you decide on something, then there's a pushback because for the longest time, even after liberalization, we never had a strong government, single party majority. Mr. Modi is the first government with a single party majority. And so often decision making kept going back and forth, and that has its impact. And many of the so-called reforms that a lot of people wanted, a lot of industrialists wanted, never happened as quickly as they could have. So it's also that in a democratic system, as against China, which is less so, decision making takes more time and it's difficult to implement and see through many of these changes.
Okay, so this is how India has grown as far as its GDP is concerned. But like you mentioned, one thing that GDP doesn't tell us is the kind of inequalities that exist within a country. And so to get a better sense of that, maybe we can look at poverty in India. And many point out that India has actually managed to lift millions out of poverty since 1947. So could you talk about that aspect a bit and tell us how many people still remain below the poverty line?
Yes. So, if you just see India's numbers in isolation, you'll have to be amazed because I was looking at the data that we had. It was close to 60, not exactly 60, but almost 60% of India's population that was living in extreme poverty, which is like $2 a day, less than that in international dollars. And this was in 1980s or early 80s. And from there, from roughly 60%, we are now down to something like 10% in those terms by the same measure. Of course, poverty lines keep changing, so I'm just giving a comparable metric. So from 60 to 10% of our population. So that's a huge thing. You've pulled so many people out of poverty, and that's a considerable success. But people must understand that today the 10% or whatever number we are now at is of a much bigger population, as against the 60%, which was of a much smaller population.
Right, 10% in 1947 is much less than 10% now because of how much our population has increased.
Exactly. So that is another element that while we have in terms of proportion brought down the number, in absolute numbers, the numbers are pretty huge. And I was just looking at some of the data in 2013. And that time, it was estimated that India had 218 million people living in extreme poverty. 218 million is more than the population of most countries in the world. And this was in 2013. And since then, India's growth has decelerated, and there are many arguments that it has actually worsened even before COVID, and then in COVID, poverty levels would have worsened. So we can just imagine that the numbers even today are high, and simply put, India is home to the maximum number of poor people living in abject poverty as of now on the planet. And that is another way to look at India's poverty record. And if we compare it to many other countries like China or say Indonesia, we find that these countries actually started with even higher levels of poverty at the same time. In early 80s, China had something like 90% people living under poverty. In abject poverty. And they have brought it down to almost 1 or 2 or 3%. So there are other countries who have done better than even our spectacular performance.
And the reason that China managed to do this, is it because of the reasons you mentioned earlier about the way its GDP grew during this period?
Yes. So, I mean, there are two things that matter in this. One is obviously GDP growth. If there is no GDP growth, then that's very difficult. You only redistribute poverty. So first thing is that the country has to make money somewhere, and that growth process has to take place. And then it's also presumed that that growth process will generate enough revenues for the government to do redistributive work, which is to say that shore up the back end, help those who are left out in terms of bringing them back into the economy, helping them get back and earn more, either through skilling them, better education, better healthcare, and getting them back into the productive part of the economy. So it's a two-way process, and both have to happen.
And Udit, you earlier mentioned that even Indonesia has managed to do better when it comes to lifting people out of poverty. And usually people don't think of Indonesia when talking about economic successes like these, right?
Yeah, so see, there is no secret to this. We often do not think in terms of the ASEAN region, but the ASEAN region is a very remarkable trading bloc. It's a very vibrant, it's possibly one of the most vibrant trading blocs in the world today. And if you look at growth rates coming out of COVID, many of these ASEAN countries were growing much better than, say, the European countries or African countries or Latin American countries. And it's only that we don't often think about them. And Indonesia in particular, the reason why I also added them, it's a very comparable country in terms of they have high levels of poverty also. They started with that fairly diverse culture. The country has population density. So in many ways, it is very similar to India in terms of the population pressures and diversity to deal with. But growth and effective management of that are the solutions.
Okay, and talking about inequality further, and here I'm actually reminded of PM Modi's Independence Day speech, where he specifically talked about women.
किसी न किसी कारण से हमारे अंदर एक ऐसी विकृति आई है, हमारी बोलचाल में, हमारे व्यवहार में, हमारे कुछ शब्दों में, हम नारी का अपमान करते हैं। क्या हम स्वभाव से, संस्कार से, रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी में नारी को अपमानित करने वाली हर बात से मुक्ति का संकल्प ले सकते हैं?
So he emphasized on the dignity of women. He said that it is important that in speech and conduct, we do nothing that lowers the dignity of women. And I was thinking of dignity in the economic context, and I was wondering in what sense has India managed to empower women economically during this period?
Yeah, so I think this particular issue about women empowerment, and not just about women being treated in a dignified manner by men, because there the agency is still in this structure, in this composition that the Prime Minister used, the agency is still with men to treat women one way or the other. I think the solution lies in letting women have the power to decide for themselves and gain the strength to live the life they want to live. The data is quite stark. If you look at female employment to population ratio, the proportion of women who are part of the employment group, in India, that proportion is not only worse than the global average, almost half of global average, it is worse than every conceivable grouping that one can have of countries, low-income countries, high-income countries, resource-rich countries, resource-poor countries. No matter which way you cut it, India is lower than that. India is lower than Pakistan, many of the Islamic nations where there are much greater curbs on the face of it on the role of women. And basically, less than 20% of our women are in the employment fold. When, say, China has something like 60%, or the global average would be something like 55%. So this is, I think, a very crucial thing. Women empowerment and women having the economic freedom to decide their own destiny. And this is starkly different from how men treat them. I think that is putting the cart before the horse. I think here economic freedom for women is the crucial thing. Until unless this happens, this is a massive hurdle. Until unless this happens, many of the other problems of poverty, malnourishment, and all of those will continue. And once this happens, a lot of India's problems in terms of economic growth and other things will automatically be solved.
And could you elaborate on how that will happen? How will women joining the labor force affect India's overall economy, India's GDP, India's poverty?
So it's not, first of all, going to be a 1-0 kind of a thing. When we say that women joining labor force, we would have to engender conditions which are conducive for that to happen. And if you think about it, one of the first things that it would require is better law and order. And law and order is not something that you can customize for one class of citizens and not for others. It's something that has to happen. And if it's improved, then it improves for everybody. Similarly, public transport or better lighting on the road. So there are many big and small changes that would precede women having the economic power.
I mean, we're talking about law and order and public infrastructure, but I think the biggest thing that would have to change is the attitude of men, right? Because men are the ones perpetrating this violence and discrimination against women.
Exactly. And it's not something that is unique about India or that India is facing just on its own. Most of the developed world face the same problems. And often the change happened in a very stark manner. If you look back, and 20th century is when it happened even in the West. It's not as if in terms of political freedom, women in India had the political freedom not too long after the women in the West had it. But even in the West, it was when women demanded it, and a considerable section, the elites in the society in the West also accepted that yes, this change has to happen, because women obviously didn't have the rights to make the change come about. So you're absolutely right. Men have to make that change, and somewhere something has to give way and kickstart that virtuous process.
Okay, so one thing is that we want more women to participate in the labor force. But even with a lot of work that women do in households, for example, I mean, that is not considered work, right? Even though it is technically labor, it is physical labor, it is mental labor, but yet they don't get any money out of it. They don't earn any income out of it. This is also the reason why a lot of women are considered out of the labor force, right?
Exactly. So this is another thing that has to happen, that it's not as if that work will not be done. Somebody will do it, but then they'll get charged for that money. It will become part of an economy, and women can then choose whether they want to earn somewhere else and pay for that service. And similarly for men, as against what is happening right now is that in the garb of certain social constructs or dogmas or cultural history or whatever, women are being given, against their choice, a lot of unpaid care work. And we all can see that, every time you order food from outside, you can immediately get a sense of the market price of what is being provided at home. And especially if you were to sort of eat out for a whole month, you will get a sense of the market price of the same. I mean, it's a ballpark way of understanding what is not being accounted for in the economy.
Okay, so we talked about GDP, we talked about poverty levels and the empowerment of women economically. What other measures can we look at to understand how India's economy has fared?
So, there are many ways to look at it. There is, within the economic fold, you would look at the structure of the economy. You could look at whether it's a predominantly agrarian economy or a manufacturing-led economy.
And by this, do you mean how diversified is the economy? Because many economists say that a diversified economy helps in raising people's income.
Yeah, I mean, see, the simple idea in terms of economic growth is that, for example, as it happened with India or with, I guess, every economy in the world, they were predominantly agrarian first, and then technological change happened, and you started adding value, get into manufacturing, and then get into the services sector. And at no point do you sort of totally go out of doing any of these things. But yes, you find your core areas of strength. And the way to sort of look at it, the broad way to look at it about the health is how much value are you adding? So if you're only growing something, say it could be corn, and just exporting that is one level at which you are performing. It could be another to grow corn, then make the chips or whatever value-added products and then export them. Similarly, it's one thing to sort of make one level of cars, low quality cars, cheaper cars, or cheaper phones. You could be making high quality phones or high quality cars, more technologically advanced, more value-added. And all of that because all of that creates greater prosperity at home. I mean, the main problem with the colonial system was that the British would use India as a resource base, take the raw material out from here, add value, and send it back to us. That was the whole problem with the economic system, apart from all the political and social ills of being colonized. But economically, we could never really stand on our feet. Just to give an example, a Tata Motors could not have bought Jaguar Land Rover. Today, it's part of our ownership. So the point is that was a structural cap that we could not have broken. Today, we have been free to do that. And so when you look at an economy, just on the economic aspect, the way it is structured and how much value people are able to generate is a crucial thing. And then therein lies all these metrics like, are our graduates employable? Are they skilled enough? So that is where the difference between having a top IIT graduate and having thousands of engineering graduates who may not actually find a job. That's the difference. And losing that IIT graduate to another country where he's creating or she's creating value for some other country.
Okay, so this is what I got out of it. And you mentioned chips earlier, so I'm going to take that example. Let's say in a diversified economy, you want to make potato chips. So you have the agricultural sector that would grow those potatoes, but then you also have a full-fledged industry that has the capability to make packaged potato chips out of those raw potatoes. And we also have skilled people to employ in that potato chip factory. And you also have people who can market those chips across the globe, basically making a potato chip that good that other countries are also buying it. So that way people in the agricultural sector are taken care of. You have an industry that is doing well, and you are also employing people, of course. Is that how this is supposed to work?
Yeah, exactly. So, you're growing the same amount of potatoes, but your economy is now advanced and it can add value. Adding value is the crucial thing. How much can you add value? Because all of that value that you're adding is adding to your prosperity. You're getting better incomes, right? And you're able to then buy goods which you may not be producing because no country produces everything.
So to what extent can India do that in the context of that potato chip example? How well are we placed?
So we're not terribly well placed because we sort of went from a massively agrarian economy to now a massively services-based economy. We had a brief phase when we sort of grew as a manufacturing base, but that remained an arrested development. It never sort of took off. And that's one of the big concerns because in India's case, there is massive population which was already involved in agriculture and it needed a sector which will soak up that excess population. And manufacturing was that sector because manufacturing can employ low-skilled people with fewer soft skills. Whereas in services sector, you need soft skills. Even if it's a guard, then the guard has to be dressed in one way. He has to behave in a particular manner. So even something as simple as a guard in a bank or in a restaurant requires a certain soft skill. Whereas in a manufacturing firm, it may happen they can absorb more labor without as many requirements for soft skills and, even with lower skills, and they can produce more. So because we did not go through that manufacturing stage, that has hurt us. And we keep hearing every year and every 5-10 years, we hear something new. The latest being the Make in India thing that started in 2016. And it's all been a failure. It has not really worked. And I've done one story which shows that between 2016 and 2020, the total number of manufacturing jobs, instead of increasing, have actually halved. We've lost jobs. And we've even seen people going back to agriculture, which is basically saying that it's detrimental because you're not adding as much value in agriculture. There is no way you will be able to grow agriculture at the pace at which, say, you and I would want our life to grow. So if you want a car, there is no way we can add enough value in agriculture in a year to get that car. It'll take many years. So basically, that is the problem.
Okay, so we have talked about agriculture, manufacturing, but what about the service sector? How well have we done there?
So services is something that we've done well. And because we have a huge population, the price of those services is much lower. And that is where a lot of those PPP terms that we tend to gain across the world, getting a haircut here is much cheaper. Or maybe getting a burger here might be cheaper. It may not exactly be the same experience, decidedly. But just in value terms, it's possible to go for a haircut and have a burger and perhaps get a massage or whatever and get a bank draft sorted in a bank. All of those services at a fraction of a cost that it takes in, say, a developed country, because there the prices of these services are much higher. So India is struggling with the employment problem because we're not able to soak up as much excess labor. And we are having trouble in terms of manufacturing. And it also means that we have to import more. If we are not creating that product ourselves, we have to import that. And that has its own repercussions in terms of the value of rupee. That has been a massive issue of discussion in the recent past.
Okay, so Udit, after having looked at all these metrics, what is the upshot for you? How would you say India has done since 1947?
So we have done very well from the fairly abject levels. I mean, even food, when we say we imported food grains when we were a young nation from US, which was largely inedible. And we still imported that, and we had a green revolution as a result of that. And today we are in a position where we can give it to the rest of the world. Actually, we are the possible providers of food grains. So we have improved on just about every count. It is possible that we'll always find, or we are finding, that there are many comparable countries who might have done better. And frankly, there might be issues with each of these countries. I mean, China is a good example. Notwithstanding many of the successes that they have, the lack of political and social freedoms itself might be an issue. So it's coming at a very different cost. Say, their policy of not allowing more than one child. That's simply not acceptable in a democratic system. So there is no direct one-to-one comparison, and that is one thing. The other is that, things like life expectancy, any of these HDI parameters. So again, we can always find, and one of the charts shows that we are behind many of these countries, but on our own, we have made giant strides. At the time of independence, or around that time, the average life expectancy of a newborn was just about 40 years. Today, it's close to 70. Now, that makes a big difference in the future of a country and what its population can do. It's again, there are flip sides to it, that, what's happening to diseases and what's happening to malnourishment, and are we doing enough? So yes, or many of those metrics might be going down, some might be going up. Stunting and wasting these are things that are massive concerns. We have, again, perhaps one of the largest pools of malnourished children in the world. And those malnourished children, every 5 years, they are turning into malnourished adolescents. And in particular, the girl child. That girl child is going to be the mother in a decade or two. So that creates its own problem. So there are different metrics. We have done very well on many metrics, and we are poised on many counts to sort of grow faster and do better. So we must not discount that aspect. But yes, there are many examples where we are behind some of the comparable countries. And so that is just to keep us grounded, to know that we have a long way to go towards achieving the goals that were set out at the time when we decided that, we wanted freedom.
You were listening to 3 Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.